for those of you who I haven't talked with, Dr. Monica Shehi, I do all the preface events. If you've been to one or two of the preface events, you've seen me, and Haley has to see me twice a week, poor thing. So I'm the facilitator of all this. But if you tell us where you're from, perhaps, what course you're all of you are English 101 students, right? But like your name and your course, that would, or where you're from, that'd be great.
I'm Chelsea, and I'm from Greer, South Carolina, so it's like 30 minutes away. And I just switched to education majors. So.
I'm Haley. I'm from Spartanburg, South Carolina, and I'm majoring in nursing so far.
It might still change.
I'm Alice Rodriguez, and I'm as well majoring in nursing. I currently live here in Greenville, South Carolina, and I was born here in California, and I come from Mexican roots.
I'm Javon Alexander. I'm from Charleston, South Carolina. That's like 3 hours away. And my major is political science with a minor in criminal justice.
I'm Juan. I'm from Bogota, Colombia. I just got here like 2 months ago. And I'm a music major. I think I'm gonna double up with communication. Communication, so yes, communication. That's what it's called.
My name's Allison. I'm from Rock Hill, South Carolina. It's about an hour and a half from here. Right now, my major is sociology, but I don't know how long it's going to stay.
My name is Hannah Zakati. I'm from Germany, and I'm majoring in business administration.
I'm Yuritsa Florencio. I'm originally from New York. I just moved here like about a month and a half ago, so I'm new, and I'm a political science major.
So you're from his neck of the woods.
Yes.
Almost. Okay. Okay, great. Well, I think we can get started. So, welcome everyone. I'm so excited you're here. You're so la crème de la crème, if I may use my rusty French here. I'm really excited that we were able to get a few students together who could represent the whole English 101 body, and those are the students who are reading the book this semester. And my idea for this interview is to kind of sit back in a more laid-back setting and have some questions and maybe follow-up questions if the time allows, because when Dr. Bayoumi gives his keynote address later today, I don't think that he will have as good of an opportunity to answer questions thoroughly and thoughtfully. So I've met or talked on the phone with most of you, and I decided on an order for the questions, and my role will be to control the traffic. I will just facilitate, even though I have questions myself, but I'll see if I can steal some of this time later on. So I won't be asking any questions myself. I will just let you ask your questions. So what we'll do, we'll go in the order that we decided earlier, and if there's time, maybe we can ask follow-up questions, but we have about an hour for this interview. So I just want to make sure that everybody at least gets to ask that one question, right? Okay, so we will start with, we're not really seated in the order of these questions, but you know which number you are, so we'll start with Chelsea's question.
Okay, I want to know, like, have you been pleased with how the book was understood by others? And, like, was the reader's reaction the way you thought it would be after reading it?
Well, thanks for your question. Yeah, I think so. I think that, you know, I decided to write this book with 2 audiences in mind. So I really wanted to write a book that was available for general readers to read and to people to sort of see something that they're not familiar with. And then there was another audience, because I also wanted young Arabs and young Muslim Americans to be able to read a book that was about their own experiences. Because that can be a different phenomenon. When you're reading a book that's about your own experience, if there's too much like elementary stuff in that kind of book, then you don't feel like it's really talking to you, like, you know. So I wanted to see if I could fulfill that challenge. Like I think writing is a lot about putting challenges in front of you and then trying to see if you can meet them. And so that was my challenge, was to see if I could like write a book that could be read simultaneously by 2 different audiences. And so I think that in the what's been very gratifying to me has been that I get basically two different kinds of responses, and from those two groups. So I get a lot of responses from general readers. Usually they say, well, I have no idea that this was happening, and and what can we do, and thank you for writing the book, and that sort of stuff. And so that's really good. And then I get other emails from other young Arabs or young Muslims, and they'll say, even though you didn't talk to me, I feel like you wrote my story. So that's also very nice. So I basically get those two kinds of responses, and I think that's what I was hoping for. So.
The next question is from Giovanna.
Okay, my question is, what obstacles were you faced with in writing this book? Have you received any criticism after publishing it? And if so, how did you handle the criticism?
Leave it to the criminal justice. All right. So what obstacles did I have? What in writing? So now I'm using my crib notes here.
Yeah.
And criticism.
Two different questions.
Yeah.
There, really.
Yeah. Because the obstacles in writing were, I think, probably more writing centered than reception centered, right? Mm-hmm. And so there are things like finding the right people to interview and then winning their trust over, because it obviously takes a lot of trust on their part to be able to tell me their stories in that kind of detail. What other obstacles? A lot of it was time management, because it takes a lot of time to write that sort of stuff. So they were really busy. They were very busy young people. A lot of them have jobs and things like that. And so for them to work with me, like those are the kinds of major obstacles. People sometimes want to ask me if there was an obstacle in publishing the book where publishers not interested, and did I have to fight to get the book published? But actually, in my situation, it was the opposite. I think the issue was enough of a current, live issue in the world that the publishers were immediately interested in the project. In terms of criticisms, well, I mean, there are. I'd have to say that all in all, the criticisms are very, very few compared to all of the rest of the responses that I hear. And the only time that it became an issue was last year. I don't know if you studied this at all, but last year, my college where I teach assigned the book as well as their common reading. Mm-hmm. And so this was, you remember last summer, it seemed like the whole country was upset by the Ground Zero mosque. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Remember that whole thing? Yeah. Yeah. And so around that exact same time is when, because I was in the summer, and the semester, the students were getting the book in the summer, they were reading it, and then the semester was about to begin. Mm-hmm. And so that's when the alumni heard that the students were reading this book as well. Mm-hmm. And so some of the very conservative alumni got very exercised and very angry. So especially one guy who lives out in California. So I blame California. So one guy who lives out in California started calling me all kinds of names and said that I was like, some kind of radical and anti-American, and that this was a pro-Islamist book and all of this stuff. And it was obvious that they hadn't actually read the book, because it didn't. How they were describing the book had no relationship to the actual book.
The person from California, he was studying in New York, or he was from?
He had studied at the same college like 30 years ago or whatever, 40 years ago. He's an older guy who still maintains connections with the college, and so and nobody really cared except he has a blog that's a very right-wing blog. So even on his blog, he calls Obama like a socialist and all that sort of stuff, and so you get the kind of person he is, right? And so he on his blog he wrote a blog post that said, "I am now, because Brooklyn College, my old university, assigned this book, I am now going to disinherit them. I'm not going to give them money after I die, because I had already, he claimed that he was going to give money to Brooklyn College after he died. So he hadn't really given any money to Brooklyn College beforehand, so nobody knows, but as soon money talks. So as soon as he says something about money, then of course it becomes a big issue, So then it became this sort of, there was a little bit of a flare-up at the same time that you had the Ground Zero Mosque thing happening. So that became a really weird moment for me, because I don't think it was really sparked by the book. It was sparked just by what the book represented to some people. And so that was even more difficult, because then I don't even want to represent myself in that argument, because I'm already being misrepresented. So why should I defend myself from charges that are blatantly not true? You know, so I decided that what I wanted to do was just keep quiet, because it's easy to get misrepresented in the media when these things happen. But then, so what happened was, you know, I mean, one day I turned on the television. I knew this was going to happen because they called me, but I turned on the TV, and then there was like the Channel 11 news saying, you know, controversy at local college because students are reading a book by this guy, and like there's a picture of me on the TV screen. You know, it's like, oh no, and like all that kind of weird stuff, right?
You're always going to find people like that, though, that aren't going to agree with your point of view.
Yeah.
So I guess, I mean,
It was to be expected.
Yeah.
And the good part of it was that there were two good things that did come out of it, I think, which is that then people who had read the book came out in support, and they said, "This is crazy. That's not the book that we read. Like what you're describing is something else."
He was talking without any knowledge.
Exactly, and so really, I think in the end, made him look much more ignorant than anything else.
I did.
Right.
Probably, yeah.
And then the other good thing was that it gave more exposure, actually, to the book in the end. So there was people who heard about it. Yeah, in the end it was.
Yeah, it had the opposite effect you wanted.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. The next question is from Ellison.
Yes, then it's not listed. But my question
Oh
was,
no.
Yeah.
But it'll be an easy one to follow, I'm
Right.
sure.
My question was, how many people did you interview for the book, and why did you choose the people you chose? Like, their story, obviously you're proving something, I feel like, with each story. So I was wondering why you chose them.
Sometimes people ask me how many, and I don't have a hard number, because it was a fairly organic, process, and it was like I would talk to a whole lot of people, and then you sort of decide, that sounds like there's more of a story there, and so you talk more to this person. So I didn't keep like a tally, I didn't have like, I'm not sure. It was like it was a lot,
Yes.
but I don't really know how many. And then, but what I did do though was, I did have, on the one hand, I had a set of issues that I felt were the important issues confronting the community. And so I knew that I wanted to have stories that I felt would speak to those issues. But I also didn't want to predetermine what the book looked like. So I wanted to be very open to hearing the kinds of stories that I would also hear. So I had a sort of split mind about the way that I was approaching it. I went very deliberately in search of a soldier, for example. Like I thought that would be an interesting story. So I wanted to find Sammy, and I found Sammy eventually. And I wanted to find Lena, because I wanted the Iraqi-American sort of counterpoint to Sammy's story. And I also wanted a detention story, like Russia's story, because I knew that the detentions were very traumatic for the community and had been almost forgotten, if not entirely forgotten, by the general public. So it was important for me to have a documentation of that. So those three I sort of went out deliberately looking for. But the rest of them, they were just sort of me hearing the stories and thinking, oh, well, that sort of links up to other things that I'm hearing. I heard a lot of anxiety from young men about getting jobs because they were worried about employment discrimination, for example. And so then that sort of fed into like Omar's chapter and stuff like that. And so it was sort of this matchup. And then the other side of it, though, is also that I wanted to make sure that the stories that I was telling were long and rich enough that I could hang a whole chapter on them, because each chapter is about 11,000 words or so. So you need to have, can't just be like one thing that happens to somebody.
Okay, thanks.
This might be a good place to insert Juan's question. He had a specific question about the Lena chapter, and Juan isn't in the list either, because he's a last-minute improvisation. But I think this would be a good time to.
Yeah, I was wondering about. I got very interested in Lena's chapter because it's a totally different chapter from the others of the book. Because in the other chapters of the book, you can see like clearly, this person was like discriminated or stereotyped in this way.
Yeah.
Like for example, in Omar's the job, or in Russia's the detention. But in Lena, I couldn't see like specifically what happened to her. Like you could see the story of like an American Iraqi in the United States and her problems with her father because she was more American than Arab and culturally. But I couldn't see like the stereotyping part of the story. So and it wasn't an issue, but we discussed it though in class. And saying like, and a lot of people ask like, why do you put Lena's chapter in this book?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and shows that you're good readers. But I think that in one way, I think that the book is ultimately about human struggle and about people being able to struggle with certain types of problems that confront them. So sometimes people ask me about the book as being a book that's about discrimination or a book that's about victims or that sort of thing. And I actually think that it's really not about that, like primarily. It's mostly about people's, young people learning through their own struggles who they are. Like that's, to me, like the sort of essence of the book. And of course, that gets compounded by all the state repression that comes in the wake of 9/11 and then the kinds of things that happen there. So there's definitely a big part of it is the rest of the book, not what happens to Lena. But you could say that Lena is also feeling like a problem because she's a problem internally to her family, right? So if the question is how does it feel to be a problem, then she knows that from how she relates to her father and these sorts of things. So there's also that side of it. And then, part of it was also just to understand the Iraqi-American experience. And I think that learning about Lena's story to me was interesting because it meant that, in a way, that politics from Iraq constantly follow you everywhere. And I think that there are places in the world where the politics are so sharp that it's really, really hard to escape from them. And so, in a way, Lena's story is more about Iraq, sort of the legacy, the burden that Iraq carries for a lot of Iraqis, even who don't live in Iraq or have very little to do with Iraq. Iraq is still around them, and I think I know that for me, growing up, as Egyptian, and my parents, the whole Arab region is so politicized and has so much politics that it was part of the bloodstream just to talk politics all the time. And so there's a way in which I wanted to also get that into the book. And I think that Lena's chapter has a way of articulating that. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it's not state repression in the same way that the others are. Although there is like some sense of like, the guy, he's spying for Saddam Hussein and then declared persona non grata and then deported to Jordan. It's kind of an incredible story. So how could I not tell that?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And that might be a good segue to Yaritza's question.
Well, I mean, my question's more, like, I know living in New York, we're kind of like in this bubble in ourselves because we see so many people of different races, of different religions, and to us, that's the world, embodied in this one place. And living like that, we might not see as much racism, as much stereotypes as we would want to see, happening. So I guess my question is, like, as far as 9/11 goes as, like, an event, like, do you think that it has exacerbated the problem of Americans trying to scapegoat ourselves once again with another group of people? Like, do you think it was exacerbated by 9/11, or do you think this is a problem that has been recurring as far as America, since the length of our country?
Yeah. I'm not sure that those two things are in opposition to each other. Like, you can have something be exacerbated by 9/11 or by a catastrophic event, but still participate in the national history of things.
But I mean, as far as like Arabs and Muslims go.
Yeah, well, certainly I think it's true that there are legacies to stereotyping of Arabs and Muslims in the United States that exist prior to September 11. And if you talk to people who lived here before September 11, say during the Iranian hostage crisis, for example, they'll talk about what it was like to live in the United States as an Iranian or even as an Arab during that period, and that was a very difficult time. So there are definitely these earlier histories, but I think that there's a kind of a quantitative difference. You know, like it goes into this whole other register. So you don't necessarily have to see it as a rupture, but as just a different register of stereotyping. And then I think also that, you know, that there is something that does concern me, and it's not just in the United States, it's also in Europe regarding this question too. And it's probably even more profound in Europe. I think that in Europe now, you know, with the whole notion of a European Union, for example, right? There's a very big question in Europe as to what is European identity, what is European civilization. And this has been a question for a generation or so in Europe. But now, especially post 9/11, there's this idea that the image of the Muslim is used in opposition to define the European. It's this way of saying, we are not that. That's how we will define us. And there is a lot of that in the United States among certain quarters, particularly I think with immigrants and Muslims now as well. Like, you know, you get a lot of sort of vilification of, I look on these right-wing websites sometimes. It's not my favorite part of my job. But there was one article that I was looking up not too recently where the guy was arguing that the biggest problems facing the United States today are, he called them Mexicans and Muslims. Right? And then he said, and then after that, part in the article, he called them M&Ms the whole time. M&Ms, Mexicans and Muslims. Mm-hmm. Like deliberately kind of infantilizing them by using the candy term, right? But there's that same sort of notion of defining, you know, a national identity by in opposition to something that you don't want to be. So I think that that's a big issue, you know, because it creates an us and them category, whereas, you know, people who are Muslim, people who are Mexican, are American. And so you're actually making a big rupture within the national fabric when you make those divisions.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually, I think, is the perfect segue to Alice's question.
The question was, do you think other races and groups other than Arabs have become a problem to the United States after 9/11?
Aha. I anticipated your question.
Yes, you did.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think that, you know, if you look at what's going on in Arizona.
Yes, I was actually talking to Miss Shehi, I'm sorry.
Or Monica.
Yes, about that. Did you hear about the new law they made in Alabama? How children of illegal immigrants are now being questioned over their parents' legal status?
Terrible.
I mean, it's terrible, and like you said, I feel like they're targeting not just the Arabs, but the Hispanic community, and especially the Mexicans in the Hispanic community.
Yes.
And I feel like they both kind of suffer the same things, the discrimination, like the chapter in Sasha, where Sasha, because of her legal status, they took advantage of that.
Yeah.
And they were actually more cruel to her than the other people in the other chapters.
Yeah.
And that's, to me, like a problem to America too, as you say.
Or in the case of Rami's father, right, who suffered mostly because he didn't have the legal status.
That's right.
It's like they're looked down upon, you know?
Absolutely. I mean, even within the immigration system, you know, they have a category called OTM.
Mm-hmm.
You know what OTM stands for?
No.
Other than Mexican.
Well, see?
Yeah.
And
so
I see a lot of this.
You see there's a lot?
Especially
I
am so sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
Well, I go a lot to Mexico, and sometimes my father drives over there, and I mean, if you see the state borderline, it's extremely covered with police officers and everything. It's very hard to get through.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But there's actually, like, I remember when I was back in Colombia, that people used to make fun of that. Not of the situation, but actually that most of the Mexican police borders, like the police, Mexican police border, were Hispanic, because you can see, like, if you go to the border, you can see that there's a cop, American cop, with his name is Juan Rodriguez, and you see.
But that's not your name, is it?
No.
Well,
my name is
But
Juan,
my last name is Rodriguez. It's a very common last name.
Sure.
Rodriguez, or Arnold Rodriguez, or Fernandez.
No, I understand.
Yeah,
your
and
point.
it would be like, I don't, and they're instructed to be like. Of course, there's some, like, it's like a little bit of Hollywood, but they're instructed to be like a little bit harsh on.
Yeah.
Because you see the border, and from the United States to Mexico, it's basically open, and from the Mexico to the United States, it's extremely a lot of police and wires
Sure.
and stuff.
And that border is not. There's a long history of that border being the
it's
other way
conflicted.
around. I mean, like, if you look at the Treaty of Guadalupe and, like, the whole history of where that border, how that border gets drawn, makes it another question as to whose territory it is and all that sort of question. But regardless of all that, you also have a history of that when it comes to, for example, the Irish in police department in New York City. The Irish were also very oppressed and downtrodden, and often working in sort of illicit trades. And so then their entry into the mainstream partly was actually going into the police force so they could police other Irish people. So it's not unheard of, I think, within the tradition of American immigration history for that to happen. But more to the point of the question that you're raising, I think it is a big problem with American identity, this idea that American identity is, do we want to draw American identity in exclusive ways or inclusive ways? Do we want to actually understand American society as a society that's made up of all different parts of a family, or do we want to say you don't belong, your kind don't belong, and our kind do belong? And I think that's a big problem, and that's a long history also in the United States of that exclusionary kind of
especially in the United
society.
States, because I heard I think it was in his possession or later that Obama said that the United States is a country based on immigrants, like it was founded on immigrants.
Exactly.
It's very hard to find like an American today that is just like pure American. Both my parents and parents are American, because I don't know, there's a lot of Americans that are Polish, Irish, Hispanic, Arabic, and it's in Europe also. So why would you define it like as an American? Because America's.
That's actually, sorry. I think Alice had a follow-up question too that I think speaks to that point, and I think we have time to ask it. So.
My follow-up question was, do you think the identity struggles some of the characters in the book experience are unique to the second-generation Arab Americans, or do you think that other ethnic groups experience these as well?
Yeah, I think that a lot of it is experienced by many kinds of people.
Non-Anglo.
Yeah,
Non-Anglo
it's a lot about the dynamics of a majority-minority culture, I think, that happens in the book. And what happens, I think, in extreme political situations is these dynamics become magnified so you can see them more openly. Right? But I think that it happens all the time. Like, and the other side of it too is, what I was really aiming for in my book, in part, was the fact that the stereotypes around Muslim life and Arab life are so prevalent that there's almost no knowledge about how life is actually lived. It's just all the stereotype instead, right? So what I wanted to do was write a book, in a way, about ordinary life and about how ordinary people react to their ordinary lives, where sometimes extraordinary things happen to them. But so there is a kind of ordinariness that I'm trying to also put at the heart of the book. And so I think that means that it should be able to translate to a lot of different ethnic groups, and not only be unique to one.
And I think the Lena chapter does that very well. I think many second-generation non-Anglo-Americans can relate to Lena and also overcome the stereotypes or see past the stereotype for that precise reason. So, okay. I'm sure we're bubbling with follow-up questions, but I want to make sure we get the ones on the list. So I think Haley is next.
Yes. Throughout the book, you have several aspects of Muslim identity that emerge. For example, some characters are described as ethnic Muslims, others like religious Muslims, and others seem more like cultural Muslims. how do you identify yourself?
Now we're getting personal.
Yeah.
We're just curious.
Well, I
about
like
the
long
person
walks on the
book.
beach. No, I mean, I was raised in a pretty religious, but in a religious, political, intellectual, like my parents are PhDs, and like, you know, so that's sort of my, you know, the milieu where I was raised. But I'm myself very secular, so I don't really.
What exactly do you mean by secular, if you don't mind me asking?
So, you know, I mean,
like, because you had a couple of characters in the book that were secular too.
Yeah.
But
well, you know, I mean, I think that in a lot of ways, let me answer your question in a little bit roundabout way. So, I think one way of thinking about it is to think about the Jewish American community, right? Because within the organized Jewish American community, you have at least 3, if not 4 or 5, or many different kinds of ways of being Jewish, right? So you have Orthodox, you have conservative, you have Reform, you have maybe Reconstructionist, and then there are other subdivisions even in between them, right? And a part of that, and so each of those groups decides on the ways in which what's important for them to be considered Jewish or to be considered religious, right? And so, and you know, within the Orthodox, they wouldn't think that what the Reform do would satisfy them to be Jewish compared to what you see what I'm saying, right? So like, and yet at the same time, all of them will probably be considered Jewish by the outside world, right? And it doesn't even have to do necessarily anything with your own personal belief system. It has to do, in a way, with your ethnicity at that level too. So that faith and ethnicity start to become really complicated questions when it comes to being Jewish. And I think that what's going on with the Muslim issue today is something that's kind of similar. It has a lot of parallels to it. So that people are being perceived as being Muslim without that perception having anything to do with what they think about Allah or Muhammad or, you know, the whole apparatus of religion. And so then you have to negotiate all of these different things. You have to negotiate how a society views you because they have all of these preconceived notions about Muslim, the same way that they do about Jewish. And then also what your individual spiritual journey is. You know, there are a lot of atheist Jewish people who will still be very proud of their Jewish identity, even though it's a religion. That might seem like a contradiction. You know, so, and one of the things that was important to me while writing the book was to show that actually the way of being Muslim is all different kinds of ways. Like people can have all different kinds of attachments to being Muslim. You don't have to just be Muslim in one way. And I think that the way in which people talk about Islam in general tends to be really, really narrow in the United States. And the ones who are the most orthodox, the most pious, tend to be the ones who get to be the representatives on the media and all of these things too. So you're leaving out like a whole lot of people when that happens as well. So I'm more in that category. Like, you know, I mean, you know, if I had to, is that on? Because
yeah. Well, actually, this might be a place for a disclaimer. Haley's my student, and the 2 characters who are described as entirely secular but Muslim are Albanian, and she has an Albanian professor who's that. But, and I gave a talk too as part of the preface event just to explain the concept of ethnic religious identity. And I think what Dr. Bayoumi is saying, that identity isn't always self-determined, just like, for example, whether you're black or white isn't always self-determined either. You might consider yourself one way or the other, but other people will also assign you in a category. And if I'm in Albania, people would immediately assign me into the category of Muslim because of my last name. And sort of giving that up or saying that I'm not Muslim doesn't mean that I don't believe in this religion necessarily. It means that I'm renouncing my family. And a lot of people feel that if they were to deny that, they would be denying their ethnicity, and that perhaps is a concept that's difficult to understand to the Native American mind, but it's very obvious to the rest of us. It may not be rational, but that's how it is, that ethnicity and religion are perceived to be one and the same. So just saying that you're Muslim is the same as saying that you are the daughter of so-and-so and the granddaughter of so-and-so. But I think Haley had a follow-up question as well that I think is interesting.
Do you think that all Muslims face the same obstacles or prejudices? I can't say the word, prejudices?
In the United States, you mean?
Yes.
Is there a difference perhaps between secular Muslims and religious Muslims?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you that I was just talking to a professor of sociology, which may or may not be your major. She did a PhD, recently finished like a year ago or so, in Chicago area, and so that was her question for her study, and so she went around and like tried to devise a study in which she could try to empirically test that thesis. And what she found was, if I remember correctly, was that it had a lot to do with name and dress. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so people who dress Muslim, men and women, so women who wear hijab, right, or men with big beards, and if they're wearing like, you know, galabeyas or anything like that, then they will encounter. She had collected more stories of discrimination based on dress from them, more stories of discrimination from them based largely on dress, and then also by name. And so, so I don't think it's going to be the same. But I don't think if you think about name as an example too, then that has almost nothing to do with religiosity, unless one decides that one's going to change one's name. Like there's a woman I know in New York who is a very strident, you know, wonderful, extremely powerful organizer. And her name, she's Palestinian American, and her name is Linda. Her parents gave her the name Linda, Linda Sarsour. So if you heard her name, you know, you wouldn't think that she was, you know, Muslim per se. So again, this is what happens. There are subtle ways in which it happens, and so it can be by name, it can be by dress, it might be other ways and other things.
I think I can relate to that as well, because my name Shehi sounds to some people as Arabic, and from time to time I will be asked, "Is your name Arabic?" And it always makes me a little bit nervous when I'm asked that. What is the difference that's going to make, right? You never know.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think dress relates to culture, and we can talk about how to negotiate cultural differences. But when it comes to names, it is a question of pure ethnicity. What are you going to do about your name? There's nothing you can do about it.
That happens to me a lot because my last name is Williamson. So when I came here, everybody thought like, you're not Hispanic, you're American. No, I was born and raised in Colombia. My dad's Colombian, my mom's Honduran. My name's Williamson, but I'm Hispanic. But everybody told me like, no, you're not, because your last name is Williamson.
Yeah.
I'm completely the opposite. My name is Alice.
Yeah.
Very American.
Yeah.
The only thing that kind of throws it off is Rodriguez.
A little bit, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And Hannah also has a nice mixed name too, Hannah Al-Sakati.
Yeah, I think that most of the people who get to know me just think that I'm European or German, but then when I tell them that I'm a Muslim too, they react, "Oh my God, no, I didn't know that." And so I think that's also has a lot of has to do with out appearance or dressing, because, well, I don't look like I'm Arab, but I'm half Syrian, half German, so and I also identify myself that I'm a Muslim, and most of the people don't know that, and they react, they are surprised when I say that.
And Hannah also has a very good question for you, I think.
Yeah, my question is, your book received both the American and the Arab American Book Award.
Yes.
And what did the American Book Award mean to you personally? So to what extent did your reaction to receiving the American Book Award differ from the reaction to receiving the Arab American Book Award?
It's a good question. Actually, the Arab American Book Award had a bigger party, so that was. I couldn't go to the party for the American Book Award because I had already made plans to be out of the country when that happened. But I guess actually it kind of goes back to the first question, because it's about the book resonating with the general audiences and about the book being meaningful for the specific audience as well. And so in a way, it's really gratifying to me to get both awards, because it means that it's valued both inside of the community and outside within the general community.
And that goes perfectly with the first question, which is,
Yeah.
what is the reaction you got out of
Yeah.
it? And it seems like you managed to reach both intended audiences well, and they both appreciated the perspectives that the book brought. I think this is a great discussion, because I think it really brings to the forefront the different aspects of the tension that exists here. That to some extent it is racial, to some extent it is cultural, and to some extent it is religious. And I think this is a country that takes pride in making one out of many, but that's not always easy either. And how we negotiate those differences is, I think, an ongoing quest. I did want to ask one question that a student who couldn't be here asked, because she was concerned, did any of the people you interviewed receive any backlash from the book being published? They were concerned about the characters and they wanted to make sure they were okay. So,
were they concerned about any one character in particular?
Unfortunately, the student is not here. But any of them, were any of them affected negatively by the publication of the book?
No, I gave everybody the option to change their names if they wanted. One person exercised that option, so I won't tell you who it is, because that half defeats the purpose. Yeah.
Right.
And then the way in which I guess it does impact people, because I've kept in touch with them. In fact, I was just with Rasha 2 days ago, because we did another event together in New York. And the way in which it affects them is that people who know them recognize them, right? So they'll say, "Did I read about you in that?" And so, and the way that they would describe that to me is they like that, like they're a little, it's like famous. It's a little bit of famous, like, yeah, that's me. Yeah. So that's the extent that I've seen. Nothing negative. Like Sammy, for example, was a little bit concerned about if the military stuff would have negative repercussions, but none of it did. No, nobody's had any negative repercussions.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
Any other follow-up questions? We've got just a few more minutes. Yeah.
How far do you think that the problem that we have in America for stereotyping, all this prejudice, like how far do you think that is from our, really this want of American peoples to have an identity? I mean, because I feel like America doesn't have a set identity as far as other countries do, like this is what we do, we're good at this, we all love this thing, we all hate that thing. But Americans, we have this kind of where we're everywhere. How far do you think it's we want to find this identity and we can't, and so we backlash against anyone available?
That's an interesting thesis. I grew up in Canada, and I became just recently an American citizen. I'm also Canadian. You can have.
You speak French?
Oui, je parle français.
Yeah.
But so I'm trying to collect as many passports as I can. So if anybody has any here, but it's funny that you mentioned this about not having an identity, because I think that if there's any one people in the world who feels like their identity is kind of unsure and eclipsed, it's Canadians more than Americans. Like Canadians, when I was growing up, the whole thing was, well, who the hell are we? We're not them, and we're not England. It's like they're a little bit of both, right? And so there was this and then their definition of their national identity in Canada was essentially, I am not American and not English, and we have national health care. Like national health care became the definition of Canadian identity. But so I think it's an interesting question, because I think, in my opinion, it's a question that's true for every society on Earth. Every society has to decide how they're going to define themselves, and it's a recurrent question. I don't think it's something. I think it happens in different ways in different national histories, and maybe with different levels of inclusions and exclusions, and maybe with different levels of violence attached and different plays of power, because it's not only a question of identity, it's really a question of power ultimately, right? But I think that, really every society is in a constant state of redefinition. I think every society is always redefining itself. Sometimes you just don't see it. If you're part of the power structure, maybe you don't see it as much unless you're threatened by it. So I think that in a way, it's something that we need to pay some attention to, the ways in which it actually recurs over and over again. Just thinking again about the sort of Muslim Mexican thing, I think it's a good way of thinking about that. Because if you think about, have you heard of this idea of the clash of civilizations? Have you heard that expression before, the clash of civilizations?
No, I haven't.
So there's this man named Samuel Huntington, who was a political scientist at Harvard. He was very influential, especially in the 70s, doing a lot of political science theory. And then in 1990, he published an essay called "The Clash of Civilizations?" saying that the Cold War is over now, so there's no longer just a clash of ideology, capitalism versus communism, but so now we're going to have different clashes. We're going to have civilization instead of ideological clashes. So he identifies 7 different civilizations, and he says the main one that we're going to be clashing with is Islamic, right? And so the article is "Clash of Civilizations?" and then he publishes it as a book, and it just becomes "The Clash of Civilizations" without the question mark. And then 2001 happens, and then that book becomes like the Bible for the Bush administration.
Right.
And they deliberately, they use it as one of their texts. I'm not making this up.
And that's when they start targeting the Arabs.
And it's sort of a justification for American foreign policy, Whereas of course it's ludicrous that there are these things I think it's ludicrous to think of any civilization as being so sealed that it's just this one thing. What is West versus Islamic versus African? The 7 categories are that he has are ridiculous. So I think that book has all kinds of problems. We can talk more about it if you'd like. But the book that he published after that, and then he passed away. The book that he next published was called "Who Are We?" And it's a book about how the nature of American society is changing because it's becoming increasingly Hispanified.
That's true.
So,
I read I think it was just before came here, I read an article that Hispanic people are now the second largest minority in the United States.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that you have to be afraid of that, right? I mean, he's saying we have to be afraid of that. So that's the question. You can hear the anxiety in the question in the title of the book. Who are we?
But then that goes back to the whole argument of America not having an identity. Thus, whenever any one identity becomes much too powerful in our eyes, we have to backlash against it because it threatens our non-identity. I mean, for example, if we just go back a few years ago, the blacks, we were targeting them because they were rather large, and they were getting bigger, and they were expanding, and they wanted more rights, and they wanted more say, and all of a sudden it was threatening whatever America was, which, quote unquote, we do not know. I guess if I could ask another question, it's, do you think this is going to die out eventually, and we're going to pick another group? Do you think this is a recurring theme that's going to continue?
There is.
Well, there is. Some of the characters in the book make that notion too. That this happened before with the Italians and
We're the new blacks. Remember you quote that?
Yeah, it's all the way. There's a sort of list. And then you say, and there is a way of just thinking. Well, this is part of this is actually the way that you write yourself into American history, is by becoming a targeted group or something, right? Which is sort of tragic. It's a kind of tragic notion of history, actually, to think so. But I think that there's something different between the things that happened in the past and what's happening now. And it's not about the character of the Arab and Muslim, but it's the fact that you have essentially stereotyped and scapegoated a community within the boundaries of the United States in a post-civil rights era United States. And the post-civil rights era was supposed to be, at least if it lived up to the values that it professed, it was supposed to be an era where we don't make those kinds of assumptions anymore. So it's even more sort of troubling that that it could happen. And then it's one other thing that's sad about it too, which is that we have to pay attention to, which is that a lot of it, in what I'm describing in the book, a lot of it is the relationship between American foreign policy and the domestic realities, right? And a lot of American history and American racial history has tended to be, not all of it, but a lot of it has tended to be about domestic issues around power and resources and these sorts of things, right? And people feel that they have more control over domestic policy than they do over foreign policy. It's hard to change American foreign policy. It's probably harder to change American foreign policy than it is to change American domestic policy. And so it puts American Arabs and American Muslims in even a more vulnerable place, because if you have more war going on over there, then there's going to be more consequences paid here as well. So that's something that I think we have to pay attention to.
In connection with Yaritza's point, I feel like I need to insert a conservative perspective just for the sake of having a balanced and fair argument. But one of our preface speakers, Mr. Ibrahim Hanif, quoted or cited an article from Ross Douthat, the New York Times conservative columnist, which was written in response to the Ground Zero mosque controversy. And you have to at least give him points for articulating something that probably a lot of people are thinking but are too afraid to say. And that's the main reason I want to mention it. But he gets to the question of American identity, and he feels that the column is titled Islam and the Two Americas, and he feels that there are two Americas, one which defines itself based on a set of political ideals that are upheld by the Constitution of the United States. So to be American means to embrace the principles that the Constitution of the United States is founded on, one of which is that all people are created equal with certain basic inalienable rights. And then there's another, and in this America, it doesn't matter what religion you have, what your name is, how deep your New World roots are, or what your culture is. As long as you pledge allegiance to the Constitution of the United States, you can consider yourself an American. But then he also talks about another America, which identifies itself as a cultural entity, and that culture is fundamentally an Anglo-Protestant, Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture that has eventually absorbed other minority cultures such as Catholics and Judaism. And he feels that the tension right now is between that America and Islam, that is, at this point anyways, that America and Islam are not compatible, and we need to look for ways in which we can become compatible. But of course, and I can understand, I guess, as an outsider who's not Anglo-American or Protestant, I can understand the desire for a cultural identity, but I also find it very problematic to say that, to allow Anglo-Saxon culture to define the whole American identity, just somehow.
Yeah, I don't think that that's true. I mean,
I agree. Like, I find like, I'm not gonna say funny, but I find like ridiculous for anyone to say that America is like entirely Anglo-Saxon Protestant, because if there's a country in the world that has formed itself from immigrants and different religions and different backgrounds, it's the United States.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that's, it might even be a generational thing that's being expressed, because I think that things are different now, and they're quite different now than they had been even 20 years ago, and certainly different than they were in 1965. And I think that it's really, people sometimes they discount the differences that the civil rights movement made in the United States. Before the civil rights movement, the United States was essentially an apartheid society. it was an apartheid society. Like, you had places that you couldn't go if you were not the right race. You know, it's incredible. Like, and now you don't have those sort of legal distinctions anymore. There's a certain, you know, that means that in the definition of being American pre-1965, that it was very clear what the hierarchy of Americanness meant, right? But post-65, that really did flatten out, not entirely. There are all kinds of problems with inequities, and there are still racisms around. And obviously they inflect a lot of different people in a lot of different ways, and I think that they can expand to other groups as well. But it's really a different society. It's a different notion of what being an American means now, I think, than it did in 1955. So I think that goes to my point, actually, I think, about the idea that every society is in a constant state of self-reinvention. And so I think we need to be able to think about what are the ways that we want to be reinventing ourselves and live up to those values that we want to live up to. What you see in the United States today is a country that is deeply, deeply, deeply divided. I agree that there are two Americas, but it's not divided along Islam lines only. It's divided along every single line, essentially. You know, the two sides can't even talk a common language. They can't even make policy together anymore. They don't even live in the same neighborhoods. Like, if you look at the voting maps, you know, it's like it's a real problem. And I think that it ends up inflecting itself in these sort of culture wars around issues around Muslims. You know, sometimes it's said that political analysts will sometimes say that the difference between Republicans and Democrats is that Republicans value freedom and Democrats value equality. Right? And Republicans...
And both are important.
Yeah. And then Democrats will say, yes, well, Republicans value their freedom to be, unequal.
Or to be to their benefit.
To be to their benefit, right. That's what their freedom is all about. Don't let, because, freedom can be an unequal... What does freedom mean? It's one of those very open...
What do Republicans say about Democrats?
I don't have as many conversations with Republicans.
Okay.
So,
I just feel like we ought to offer.
No, yeah, sure. But I would bet that what they would say is that if equality, that means that equality tramples on people's freedom.
Yeah.
Right. You can see how it could work both ways, but I think it just illustrates how you can take the core values of a society as a way of dividing the population rather than even uniting them. So how are we going to work towards a unified society?
And there should be a potential to take our core values and find common ground and find a way to unify ourselves. Well, our hour is up, and I want to point out how generous it was of Dr. Bayoumi to, first of all, agree to be interviewed and then agree to be filmed, which other people would have either charged for or not agreed to at all. So thank you everyone for coming out, and thank you especially to Dr. Bayoumi for agreeing to sit down with us.